All right. Welcome to Best Gravel and Adventure Bike for New Riders in 2025. Here's the criteria we're working around. It's not going to fit for everybody. Probably 75 to 80% of newer riders, this is a good fit. But if you're one of those outliers, stick around towards the end for more alternatives. This is more than a PowerPoint. We're going to show actual bikes here and talk about the ins and outs of them. A main issue for newer riders is affordability. That's towards the top of our list. Capability. This is something maybe newer riders may not think about completely. Availability. We'll talk more about that in depth. And what may be most important that maybe not everyone takes into consideration is flexibility. And what do I mean by these criteria? Affordability, ideally under $1,500 at your local bike shop. Local bike shop is super important here. We are huge proponents of going to a bike shop to purchase a bike, particularly if you are a newer rider. There's a lot to learn, and the vast majority of shops aren't going to steer you the wrong way. I know it. Some folks are going to go $1,500. That's ridiculous. We can get into the $1,000 range. We'll show you that here shortly. If you're looking at much less, you probably don't want to be looking at doing true gravel and adventure riding, but I'm not being a bike snob here. Realistically, $1,000 to $2,000, that's a sweet spot to have a perfectly capable bike. By capable, we mean durable and simple. It's going to put up with miles and miles and hours, potentially days upon end of rough riding. And we want it to be simple to maintain. We don't want it to be finicky. Availability is super important. It doesn't do me any good to point you to some unicorn bike that you can't find anywhere. We're trying to find bikes that most people can find at a local shop or get into a local shop fairly easily. And on the flexibility side, here's something that I consider super important going forward for newer gravel riders and realistically even for existing gravel riders. The flexibility aspect is probably in your best interest to look at bikes that can handle some mountain biking, not Red Bull Rampage, taking 20-foot drops or nothing like that. But if you find yourself on super rough double track or Jeep road, or just to get some dirt that's not playing in traffic, maybe you have to do an easier mountain bike trail. To have a gravel bike that has that capability, that gives you a lot more options. No, we're not talking anything like this. If you're looking for a $10, $15, $20,000 bling bling bike, please do move on. I'm wasting your time. But if you're looking for something more practical to start out with, we're going over the features to be looking for in a bike, not a specific brand. I'm going to show some specific brands and their build out kits and things like that. But we're primarily talking about the features to be looking for. Not every bike shop has access to every bike. But if you have the features in mind and the why you want those, and you talk to a local shop, even if they don't have access to these specific brands, they can probably point you in the right direction. Please feel free. If you have other bikes and what I talk about here, feel free to add them in the comments. If they fit the criteria we're looking for, I'm happy to share them all. We're not trying to sell any particular bike here. We're going to focus on the frame material as a key piece of this, and this really comes into the affordability and the functionality. Tire clearance is huge. No pun intended. We'll talk about that more. Gear range, again, this is something that maybe newer riders don't think about. We'll talk about the whys and the wherefores of that along the way. And we're back to simplicity, particularly for newer riders. You don't want equipment that's difficult to work on, that you can't find parts for, that's finicky as hell. The frame material that we're building this concept around is aluminum. A, it's inexpensive. 2, it's extremely durable. And C, it's generally pretty light, and it's going to be long lasting. Yes, there are going to be bike snobs out there that turn their nose up at the thought of aluminum. Just ignore them, because another major feature we're talking about is tire clearance. Realistically, these days, 2025 and forward, ideally you want the ability to clear 50 millimeter tires. 45s are okay. 50 millimeter and up is better. And the reality is, once you start getting into 45 millimeter and up tires, the supposed downsides of aluminum really don't come into play. The more volume in the tires offsets any perceived stiffness or potential discomfort from aluminum. Bigger tires make up the difference. Don't let the aluminum naysayers steer you too much on that. Along the lines of tire clearance, we're big proponents of tubeless tires in general. It's tough to find a bike under $2,000 that's already tubeless. There are some out there, but at least tubeless ready. And we'll talk about that more in this particular bikes and the whys and the wherefores of it. The one upgrade that might come into play for a lot of these bikes right off the bat. Another aspect is gear range. This is something that kind of maybe gets diminished a little bit. From my perspective, you want at least a 40-tooth chain ring on a 1x setup. If you get stronger or start riding faster or riding potentially with faster groups, you don't want mountain bike front chain ring, single chain ring gearing, 32 tooth chain rings. And in a nutshell, to be honest with you, where I started with this, the ideal setup that I was thinking of for a beginner would have been an old school hardtail mountain bike with a rigid fork. There just aren't those bikes around anymore for newer bikes. You can find some old ones, but to find a new bike off the shelf right now, you're going to look at a gravel bike. And as everyone's been saying for a number of years now, gravel bikes are basically becoming the mountain bikes of old. There's a lot of crossover there. But with the gravel bike, you want that 40-tooth chain ring. We'll go into more detail on that as well. Simplicity. This is super, super important. When I say simplicity, it means you want components that are from the major brands, that if something breaks, you can get it replaced fairly easily and hopefully inexpensively. We're not looking at the blingiest stuff, but extremely capable and durable is important. There were some other bikes I was looking at that didn't quite make the cut as my first tier recommendation because they were a little bit more old school. There's some basic upgrades on this bike that maybe down the road, if you get into it and you want more capability, it may be worth an upgrade down the road. Some of the other bikes I was looking at really didn't have that upgrade capability. This one can be. Very certainly disc brakes are a gotta have right now. It's almost doesn't even need to be said these days. But for those that are going to say, oh, look at an old mountain bike, look at an old hardtail mountain bike. The reality is an older hardtail mountain bike with disc brakes that's in decent shape is probably going to be close to this price range as well. You have to start looking at rim brake, older mountain bikes before you get really bargain basement. And it's doable. Make no mistake. If you're really on a budget, that may not be the worst way to go. So that's the basic functionalities we're looking at right there. Let's go look at some real bikes now. So what we're starting with right now, and there are other bikes, but I think this is a super, super good starting point for, again, most newer riders out there. This is the Salsa Journeyer. This is the flat bar edition, not the drop bar. And the reason I'm starting with the flat bar, there's two key reasons. One, particularly if you're a newer rider, a lot of people are going to be more comfortable starting with a flat bar setup. And if you do end up taking it on some mountain bike trails, which this bike is completely capable of, there's no doubt that the flat bar setup is going to be more comfortable for newer riders than a drop bar on a mountain bike trail. The other reason is, quite frankly, the flat bar setup is less expensive than the drop bar setup. So this is a $1,200 bicycle MSRP. That's the actual retail price. These days, most likely you're going to be able to get it at a bike shop for less than that. I'm not going to pretend to know what the discounts are, but probably safely in that $1,000 range. Now let's go over the build kit on this bike and why it's really high on the recommendation. It does have the aluminum frame and it does have an aluminum fork. The aluminum fork itself is potentially the biggest drawback on it. I say that I've ridden bikes with aluminum forks, and with the bigger rubber, we're back to I'm fine. In the long run, would I prefer a carbon fork? Probably. And again, that's one of the features. If somewhere down the road you want to upgrade to a carbon fork, this bike is modern steer tube, modern through axle, things like that. You can upgrade the fork set down the road, but I don't think it's a necessity. Gravel geometry, internal cable routing, not a big deal. Dropper post routing, okay. Cargo capability, that's a huge plus on this bike. You do have the fork mounts here. You have multiple mounting bosses on the frame itself. You can take this bike packing or just have all the bags or mounts or water bottles that you could imagine needing. It's built in. A potential downside of this, 38 millimeter tires are stock. We'll talk about that more in a moment. Let's go over the specifics on the build kit itself and some of the whys and the wherefores on it. No front derailleur. It's a single chainring. It is we'll get to that in a moment. It's a 10-speed cassette. I'm a big fan of this myself. Once you start getting into 11 and 12 speed, it does get more finicky, a slightly less gear range though. The crankset, it is a 40 tooth. And that's what I was talking about. If you were looking at a hardtail mountain bike, you would probably be looking at a 30 or 32 tooth chainring, which if you start getting up to speed or riding with groups, particularly on gravel, you may not be able to keep up. Shimano Dior. So this is not the highest level Shimano by any stretch of the imagination, but this is perfectly capable Shimano and readily accessible Shimano. Tektro brakes, not a drawback per se, but maybe one of the nicer brakes would be nicer, but you're not going to, at this price point, it's going to be tough to get nicer brakes. The wheels, WTB Serra with through axle hubs, with the through axle front hub. Looks like a quick release rear. I do apologize, just now noticing that. And the 38 millimeter tires. That is probably the one thing that right off the bat, this bike will take a 50 millimeter tire. I would go ahead and put 45s or 50s on it and make sure it was tubeless conversion. That would be the one thing I would change on this bike myself. So maybe you're looking at another $100 to $200 investment, depending on the tires you get and the labor charge involved if you don't do it yourself. Bike weight is around 25 pounds. That's another big goal of this. Really think you want to be under 30 pounds, generally speaking, but I don't think you need to be a weight weenie trying to get it down under 20 pounds. If you start 22 to 25 pounds is a really good weight range. It's easily manageable to throw in a truck, put on a hitch rack, move around, pick up, and things like that. Again, this is with the flat bar setup. I know a lot of people are going to go, well, gravel bikes are supposed to be drop bar. We're going there next, but for a lot of newer riders, flat bar is probably a better setup to begin with. So that's the Salsa Journeyer. They do have a bunch of different options in a plethora of price ranges. Okay. Here's the one we were looking at, the 700C Dior, $11.99 MSRP. I wouldn't go with any of the flat bars with the lower price point build out kits, the Altus. That's my suggestion. But I think the Dior package is really good, particularly since it's probably available for considerably less than that $11.99. If by chance you wanted to go drop bar, this Journeyer Apex is a really good package. It is, there it is, $15.99 MSRP. This is higher end components, generally speaking, and I don't have this particular bike myself, but I have spent a lot of time on a very similar bike with a very similar build out. We'll talk about that in a little bit. This is a really good drop bar, very capable entry level bike. Here's the one suggestion of who I would point towards the drop bar versus the flat bar. If you're first starting out, I think most people would be more comfortable to begin with on flat bars. It could be likely within 6 to 12 months that you're ready to go to drop bars and you may need to change bikes. But if you don't know you're going to get into it, that flat bar bike is something you can keep forever in the garage and just whenever you want to go for a spin. If you do really start getting into it and start going on group rides or group road rides, you're probably going to want a drop bar setup to be able to keep up with the crowd, generally speaking. That upright flat bar position is going to make you a slower rider. I'm not talking about that from a racing perspective, not talking about race speeds. I'm just talking about efficiency and general speed of the group you're riding with. If you're upright, your chest is a big old sail just slowing you down. And when you're in the drop bars, you are more aerodynamically efficient. You are going to go 1 to 2 miles an hour faster. And that does add up. If you're going 2 miles an hour faster and you go on a 2-hour ride, you're going to be 4 miles ahead of the person that was going 2 miles an hour slower. Make sense? And if you're that person, you're the one that's 4 miles behind. That's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm happy to bring up the tail of the field myself. But I can speak on how fun the components and capable the components on this bike are. I do not have the Journeyer. It's actually my wife's bike, but I enjoy the hell out of riding it. We're going to talk about it in a moment. The Salsa Confluence with a very similar build kit, but there's a very fundamental difference. So if economy and just starting out and full range of flexibility, I highly recommend the flat bar, particularly if you think you might use some mountain bike trails, go on single track, which these days there's more and more of that's going to happen. Most people are riding gravel because they want to stay out of traffic as much as possible. If you live in a major metro area, it's harder and harder to find gravel that's easily accessible. It might be easier to find urban mountain bike trails or Jeep roads or things like that. So maybe a flat bar setup isn't a bad way to go to get started. As you build endurance, as you build fitness, as you build skill level riding the bike itself, maybe the drop bar might be more efficient. If you know you want to start with the drop bar, I think this Apex 1 setup is very good. Now, where I would like to go from here, quite frankly, is I know there's a lot of folks that were riders previously that have been out of it for a while for various reasons, and maybe they need to get back in shape. One of the things that's been a barrier, so to speak, is they know how long it takes to get back to where you were before. I am a huge proponent at the moment of e-bikes for getting back into the swing of things. And here's the Salsa Confluence that we have in our house. We have the Confluence Apex 1. It's generally speaking, a very similar bike. It's aluminum frame, a little bit nicer components. This does have the carbon fork, but it is a class 1 e-bike, but it's about a 30-pound bike. This bike is fantastic. And particularly if you're trying to get back in the swing of things, but you want to be able to ride with the group, this is a great way to bridge the gap. And you can ride this one as a non-e-bike, and it rides almost like a regular bike. This is a fantastic transition for folks that are wanting to get back into it. But this isn't, this is definitely a higher price point, $3,000. And I'm pointing to the Salsa Confluence in particular because we have personal experience with it. I know there's other bikes out there as well. I would love to hear other comparable gravel and adventure e-bikes that are out there. Those are the two beginner bikes or coming back that I recommend. I definitely recommend working with a local bike shop. Talk about the capabilities you're looking for, and they'll point you in the direction to what they have available to them that meet those high points. Now, I know some of you are going to be super, super adamant about, I don't need no bike shop. I'm going to buy online. All right, you do that, particularly if you're newer. I think that's a mistake. If you don't know how to fit a bike, if you don't know how to dial it in, if you don't know how to adjust everything just so, you're not going to learn that just reading stuff on Facebook message groups or anything like that. So I always recommend going to the bike shop and going to them. And at these price points, you're not going to find anything better, quite frankly, online. But if you're bound and determined to buy direct online, here are my 2 recommendations. Just for bargain basement aspect of things, the State 4130 All Road They have them available in drop bar and flat bar. It's a $900 bike, sub $900. And quite frankly, this goes on sale very, very regularly where I think they take a couple $100 off of it. If you're just looking for the most inexpensive option, look at the State steel bikes. These are going to be heavier, but extremely budget friendly and durable and simple and meet a lot of those criteria. Again, I do recommend the flat bar setup with the 650 wheels with the bigger tires myself, just so you do have the mountain bike capability if needed. But the drop bar is not a bad way to go. Going direct, but you just can't bring yourself to go aluminum, or you want to be cool and blingy-ish. The Loft Sigla is probably the direction I would go myself. This is about these two bikes, if I had to go direct, are about the only two I would personally consider. Everything else I would be going to a bike shop and going with. The Loft Sigla, it's a lot of bang for the buck. It is a carbon frame. You can go a rigid fork or the Loft fork. Realistically, if you're going with a Loft, get the fork. If you don't get the fork, it's not anything much different from any other carbon gravel bike out there, generally speaking. Get the Loft fork, core wireless, or the Weekend Warrior transmission. I mean, you're up $3,000 to $3,800, and there are even higher level ones. But that's a lot of bike with that fork for $3,000. And it does have the tire clearance for the mountain bike stuff. Realistically, if you want a true drop bar mountain bike, I would go back to Salsa and look at either the Cutthroat or the Fargo, depending on what your needs are. But if you're bound and determined to buy direct and carbon, Loft is the way to go, in my opinion. If you have comments or you want to talk about it, please visit our spinistrychat.com community site. We're building this out and hoping to get lots of discussion. You can go there. You'll get access to our full Club Spinistry routes library. This is a free site. You don't have to be a Club Spinistry member to utilize the discussion and functionality that we have. There's a Spinistry calendar there. And obviously, any questions you have about gravel, bikepacking, adventure, and so forth, please share them there. Thanks for joining us.